In the midst of all of this tale of decayed ambition, desperation, madness, there was a breath of fresh air. A wholesome doctor's daughter from Wisconsin who transferred to UCLA as a theater arts major was signed by Paramount, and after appearing in a Randolph Scott Western, was notified via phone call that Billy Wilder wanted her to play Betty Schaefer in Sunset Boulevard. She ended up owning the part with such incredible authenticity that her work earned her a Best Supporting Actress Oscar nomination. She will join us here tonight, and I am thrilled that Nancy Olson has consented to be our guest today, and she will join me on stage after the movie to talk about Sunset Boulevard and a whole lot more, because I can tell you one thing, Nancy Olson Livingston has lived the life.
That's a long, long time ago. To see yourself so many years ago, that's filled with memories, filled with regrets. There are things in a couple of those scenes that I just saw. I thought, why did I do that? Why didn't I do something else?
The actor's lament, right? Nancy, when you were...
Just have to tell you one thing.
Sure.
In the scene when I leave the house, actually, my eyes were filled with tears and they were shining on my cheeks, but the camera really didn't get that. And I sat there and I thought, why didn't they show those tears? Anyway.
A lot of actors that I've talked to have said, you know, when you're making a movie, you really don't have any idea if it's going to click, if it's going to be great, good, bad, indifferent. It just seems with this movie, you had to know when you were making the film, at what point or did you know it was special?
Well, first of all, I had no idea who Gloria Swanson was. I knew who Bill Holden was, and I knew who Erich von Stroheim, because I was a student at UCLA, theater arts student, and one of the things that we studied were the great filmmakers, and he was one of them. So I knew who he was. Certainly I knew who Billy Wilder was, and Charles Brackett, the co-writer and the co-producer. But who in God's name was Gloria Swanson? So I asked my mother, and she said that she was a great, great film star of the 20s and the 30s. So what was interesting, Alan, is that of all the people that read this script, which is a daring, daring script, especially at that time, but I think any time, actually, it's a story that has a kind of resonance and truth about people selling their souls, as Bill Holden did, to survive. And what falling in love with the wrong person at the wrong moment and the consequences of all that. Anyway, it was Gloria who really knew that this film was going to make history. And it was her passion. In fact, she would stay after 6 o'clock. We got there at 7 in the morning, started shooting at 9, and we finished at 6. And she would beg Billy to stay and work with her after 6 on the scene for the next day. She was totally dedicated, absolutely determined, and I'll tell you something else that's interesting. Every night, there were about 15 or 16 films being all shot on the lot at Paramount at the same time. And there was, you know, Bing Crosby and Bob Hope and Alan Ladd and a whole variety of stars. And all the dailies were shown at 6 o'clock in a little theater. And the various technical people, the directors, the people who wanted to look at what yesterday's dailies or yesterday's shooting looked like. So they would go, they would look at their own dailies, and they would leave immediately. Well, guess what happened? Sunset Boulevard started to show its dailies, and nobody left. They wanted to, when they saw their own, they would say, wait a minute, I got to see yesterday's dailies on Sunset. They were so intrigued. It was so unusual.
That is unusual. In fact, I've never heard of that happening with any other film, the making of any other film, where it became almost an episodic serial at the studio. Never heard of that.
They had to bring in extra seats, as a matter of fact.
I can see why. It seems Billy Wilder, what he was dealing with, I read an interview he did with Cameron Crowe where he was just setting out to stretch himself by doing this, but it was really a fine line he was walking between to prevent the film from verging into campiness.
Absolutely.
And how do you think he maintained that, where the tone of the film was so crystal clear?
I think that it was a process. I really do. Because his first thought was Mae West. Can you imagine Mae West? Those of you will remember Mae West.
Yes.
And like me. And then he thought about Mary Pickford. My goodness. Anyway, he also wanted Montgomery Clift to play Joe Gillis. And Monty Clift said no. He was a little afraid of this. It got a little too close to home.
Yes, it did. It did. I touched on that in the introduction, but I didn't. Apparently, or so it was said, Monty Clift was involved in a relationship with an older woman at the time. So he had his reasons.
Yes, he did. But Gloria Swanson was the absolute perfect person, and she understood that the danger was to become high camp. This film had a message. This film told the truth about not only the film business, but the world. And I'll get into that a little bit later, but also I want to tell you that the perfect casting was Bill Holden. He was under contract to Paramount. Now you have to understand about Bill. He was a great star. He did Our Town and The Golden Boy.
Golden Boy was like...
Golden Boy
Yeah.
was an absolute triumph.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the Second World War came, and he had to go to war. So he came back, and he, in a sense, started all over again. And he became kind of the second lead. He did a picture called Apartment for Peggy, and he was the husband, and it was about Peggy. It was not about him. So he was in a marriage that wasn't working. He started to drink very, very heavily. And he was a deeply disappointed and disturbed man at that point in his life. So that for him to play Joe Gillis, who was at the end of his rope, had no place to go. And Cave, you would never believe that such a beautiful, talented, interesting man would put himself in this kind of situation unless he was desperate. And he was. Bill Holden was desperate. And it changed his life. The relationship with Billy Wilder changed his career. So nobody was more perfect than Bill, and also Gloria, Eric, and what about me? I don't know.
You were, during my introduction, I said you were the one breath of fresh air into all of this corruption and moldering and leaves and rats and swimming pools and all of this. You were, when Billy called you and you first talked to him, how did he approach you?
No, what was interesting was that I was under contract and continued to go to school, but I was fascinated with the studio, and I was watching everybody and taking internal notes. And Billy Wilder, I certainly knew who he was, would stop me and talk to me and ask me all kinds of questions. My father was a doctor. I grew up in the Middle West. What was I taking at the university? What did I enjoy? What was I learning? And he was talking about all these kind of vague things. And I think, honestly, that the casting was a problem. I was an aspiring writer, Betty Schaefer. So I had to sound somewhat educated and articulate and strong. I was a strong person. And that kind of came across, I think, to him. And that's what he wanted. And I have to tell you, my nickname in college was Wholesome Olson.
Perfect casting, I might
So
add.
what he wanted was this really kind of straight, kind of, resolved young woman. And so, you asked me today, you said, what kind of a director?
Yeah, how did he direct the actors? How did he direct you?
He never directed me. And we'd start a rehearsal and he'd say, that's fine, Nancy. That was it. And so we would go ahead and do the scene. So I think that was part of it. Plus, the studio had me under contract. And they were already paying me $300 a week, which, by the way, I could never see. My parents had to put that into a fund because I was under 21. I was actually 20 when I made the picture. It's not 22. And you wonder about destiny. You wonder about how your life takes turns, what doors open. The door opened, and I became a leading character in one of the greatest films ever made. That is amazing when you think about it.
It is?